Hello everyone and welcome to episode 8 of the Layton Fitness podcast. So in today's episode we're going to be talking about protein requirements and more specifically whether there's any difference between the protein requirements for someone in a dieting phase and or the differences between that and someone in a muscle gaining phase. Now, one of the things that you'll probably notice when we go through this is the differences are almost somewhat minute. However, the importance of sufficient protein either within a dieting phase and or a muscle building phase are absolutely paramount. So before we dive into the specifics of my various recommendations, I think it's useful just to give a very brief overview of why protein is important. I don't want to spend too much time on this because the majority of the people listening to this podcast probably have a good understanding of why protein is important. However, I just thought it would be useful just to briefly go over this and then we're going to dive straight into my recommendations. Now, the main reason for protein within our diet is for two main reasons, mainly one, nitrogen, as well as individual amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein. These are essential within an individual's diet. So protein's primary role is mainly structural. So most athletes are probably aware that their skeletal muscles are made up of protein, but that's not all. Both cardiac as well as skin and hair also contain protein as well. So even though protein's main requirements are mainly structural, protein can also be used for energy, and this usually is under low carbohydrate conditions. So essentially, just to give an overview, protein is absolutely paramount within a dieting phase, within a muscle gaining phase, and just for general health. But more specifically for individuals looking to lose body fat and gain muscle, the main reason it's so important during that dieting phase is essentially lean mass retention. So we need to really be making sure that we're consuming sufficient protein. Then when we're in dieting conditions, we're mainly just losing body fat and or water and glycogen as well, but we're trying to retain as much muscle mass as possible, which can be done through the diet and the training component as well, mainly focusing on your weight training, which we've discussed in previous episodes. We won't be diving into that as much today. Now, within the context of muscle gain, essentially your body is in a constant state of either muscle protein synthesis or protein breakdown. Your goal is hypertrophy. The goal is to essentially be in a net surplus by the end of the day, by the end of the week, over the following months, over a chronic period of time. If that's in place, with the caveat you're consuming sufficient calories, you're going to see muscle gain. Now, it's also important to discuss any potential harmful negatives which unfortunately have been portrayed in the media, and you may see various things on the news or in newspapers or magazines where they're essentially slamming protein and saying it can be harmful to your kidneys. To my knowledge, as of yet, there's no evidence to support that notion within individuals who have healthy kidneys. So that's the big caveat there. If you're a healthy individual who's got healthy kidneys, there's no evidence to support that high protein diets can have a negative effect on your health and or your kidneys. Now, as I've discussed in some of my previous podcasts, one very recent Eric Helms study looking at protein intakes within the context of contest prep bodybuilders. And the reason why I like this study, in addition to looking at the rest of the weight of available evidence, is because it's very relevant to people listening to the podcast, my clients, and those looking to maintain as much muscle mass during an extended fat loss phase. I really would suggest looking at this online. So there's a 2012 study, Eric Helms. The study is called Evidence-Based Recommendations for Natural Bodybuilding Contest Preparation, Nutrition and Supplements. So type in something like that into Google and you should be able to find the study to look at yourself. And Eric's conclusion came out with 2.3 grams to 3.1 grams per kilogram of body weight is a very good starting point to work from. So will there be any big significant differences between an individual in a fat loss phase and a gaining phase? Yes, there will be. Essentially, amino acid oxidation, essentially protein requirements should be a little bit higher during a fat loss phase in comparison to a muscle gaining phase, because in the muscle gaining phase you've got essentially a surplus of calories. You don't really need the minimum requirements. With that said, I'll then focus on the higher end of those requirements during a fat loss phase of 3.1 grams per kilogram of body weight, and perhaps on the lower end for a muscle gaining phase of 2.3 grams. Now, it's also important to know that there can be some outliers to this formula. There may be people that require slightly higher than this, or even some people that can get away with too little. However, it's important to note the negative effects of consuming too much protein are little, if any, at all, whereas the negative effects of having too little can really, potentially, if you're in a dieting phase, mean more muscle mass lost. Therefore, always err on the side of too much than too little. But that's a good way to look at it. If you're in a dieting phase, protein requirements will be slightly higher, therefore aim for the higher end, and if you're in a gaining phase, you aim for the lower end. However, as I just mentioned, I don't like to manipulate protein too much, just because I'd rather have too much than too little, because the negative effects are minimal, if any, for too much. The only thing you want to consider is you don't want to go too high with the protein, and that can essentially impede your total calories you can then place for carbohydrates and fats. Mainly carbohydrates would be one you're constantly looking to increase during a muscle gaining phase. So one, this is obviously going to help with hypertrophy, muscle growth, but in addition to this, they can really help with gym performance, e.g. allowing you to move more weights within the gym and therefore stimulate progressive overload and therefore allow you to add more total volume to your sessions and therefore increase muscle gain, hypertrophy. So you don't want to go too high and impede that potential carbohydrate allotment within your daily targets. With regards to frequency, I've discussed this in detail in some of my other podcast episodes, specifically episode number 2 when I was talking about post-workout nutrition. However, it's important to know within dieting context, the frequency, the evidence available suggests that protein frequency should be a secondary factor. So therefore, if you choose to consume a lower meal frequency, this isn't going to impede lean mass retention during a dieting phase. With that said, I still wouldn't suggest going too low on the extremes in terms of meal frequency. However, with that said, it's important to look at some great anecdotal evidence in terms of the intermittent fasting crowd who have 2 to 3 meals a day and do very well at maintaining as much muscle mass during the fat loss phase. And the main reason being the hierarchy of importance is still consuming sufficient protein by the end of the day. That's still the most important factor. However, with regards to an optimum meal frequency for muscle gain, we're still in the dark a little bit in terms of what's the optimal meal frequency for an individual looking to gain muscle mass. With that said, I'd still focus on that hierarchy of importance first, e.g. total protein met before the end of the day. And I've also got an excellent quote here from Alan Aragon, who did that very recent meta-analysis of the evidence looking at meal frequency, or looking more in depth at the quote-unquote anabolic window, which, as I've discussed, is somewhat of a myth when you look at some of my other podcast episodes. And Alan says the following: I would err on the safe side and go with 3 protein-rich meals as an optimal minimum meal frequency for anabolism, so muscle growth. It strikes a compromise between conservative and practicality, exploiting the hypotheticals. So essentially saying that make sure you hit sufficient protein first, and at the same time, by having 3 protein doses a day, you will basically take advantage of any hypothetical benefit of a higher meal frequency. Now, with that said, it's important to know when an individual's in the gaining phase, when they're consuming a lot of calories, the meal frequency is somewhat of a non-issue, because by default, because they're consuming so many calories, this is probably going to fit within 3 to 6 meals per day anyway. I'd find it very difficult if someone's an advanced trainee who's in a energy surplus, the amount of food required, who's just consuming 1 to 2 meals a day. It's just not feasible. So therefore, by default, this total calories almost forces an individual to consume 3 to 6 meals per day. So therefore, I wouldn't really worry about this too much at all. Whereas in the fat loss context, I would let the meal frequency sit with your preference. However, making sure you're still meeting them total macronutrient targets before the end of the day. Now, it's important that I discuss why I set my protein requirements based on body weight and not lean mass. So I've actually discussed this in a little bit of detail in some other podcasts as well, but it's actually very difficult to gauge someone's lean mass. Even DEXA scans have their limitations. However, there's a big caveat for this. Obviously, if you have an overweight individual or, say, a male over 20% body fat, quite obviously that person's protein targets are going to come too high if you base it on body weight. So therefore, this is something I learned from Alan Aragon. He essentially, for this individual, placed protein requirements based on their goal body weight. So for example, if they're currently at 100 kilograms and their goal body weight is 75, I will place protein requirements based on their goal body weight, 75 kilograms, and then you could fit it between 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of body weight. So hopefully that makes sense there. Now, with regards to the types of protein, I wouldn't obsess about what's better source of protein, chicken or eggs or anything like that. I would just focus on a wide variety of protein sources, and the reality is once you're consuming sufficient protein, the actual quality is somewhat irrelevant as long as you're consuming complete proteins with a full array of essential amino acids, which is essentially any type of meat, fish, whey protein, casein. Any of those, you're going to be absolutely fine. So by obsessing about which protein source is better than the other, don't even contemplate this. This would only be important in circumstances where you're consuming very little calories, you're consuming insufficient protein. So, for example, people living in third world countries who are barely eating anything at all, choosing a X protein versus another can have a significant difference. But within the context of sufficient protein, which you will be consuming, especially if you're in a muscle gaining phase as well, added to that, there's no need to be splitting hairs between whether you consume chicken or turkey your next meal. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, another thing I wanted to bring up is there seems to be this misconception around whey protein, and there's a limit to how much you can consume this throughout the day, and that's quite frankly ridiculous. It's a complete protein that contains all the essential amino acids, has a very high biological value. Therefore, there's no reason why you couldn't consume this more than once per day. Now, I'm not saying you just consume whey protein throughout the day, but at the same time, a lot of my clients, and I know myself personally, there's no reason why you can't use this more than once a day. It's cost effective, it's convenient, and it essentially just makes your life that much more easy. Now, like I said, don't just consume this all throughout the day. Have a variety of other protein sources, but don't be boxed into, I've just had whey protein this meal, therefore I can't have it later in the day. There's absolutely no issue with that whatsoever. Just make sure you're still meeting sufficient protein by the end of the day, and you've taken on board the other recommendations I've made within this podcast episode. So hopefully you've enjoyed this episode, and I will look forward to speaking to you next week. Also, if you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, where I teach you how to set calories, macronutrients, so protein, carbohydrates and fats, as well as teaching you how to manipulate these to move you closer to your fat loss or muscle gain goals. If you go to James Layton, Layton fitness.co.uk, and there's a tab at the top of the page that says free ebook, click on that and you can download that immediately. So thank you very much, guys. I look forward to speaking to you next week.